So, this evening, I am profoundly honored to introduce Professor Chomsky, Noam Chomsky. Professor Noam Chomsky is an emeritus professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He is a philosopher, linguist, political activist. He is called the father of modern linguistics and had a debate with the French structuralist philosopher Michel Foucault in 1971. So, ladies and gentlemen, uh, let us welcome Professor Noam Chomsky.
Pleased to be with you.
Okay. So, good evening, Professor. So, it's good to have you here. So, the title of our conversation this evening is Language, Artificial Intelligence, and Democracy. So, our conversation will go around these three distinct and broad but interrelated subjects. So, we will discuss each one of them pretty substantially. So, let me begin our conversation with language. So, you said, Professor, that our capacity to acquire language is pre-programmed or hardwired in us by a long history of evolution. Therefore, all of us, by this I mean all Homo sapiens, share the same universal linguistic structure. And this universal linguistic structure sets limits to what we can say and what are the things we put within the frame of language. So, is my summary of your view, Professor, correct? Do you still hold this view? And could you please elaborate this view better than what I have just said?
Well, there is, of course, a long history of evolution back to the origin of life. But the emergence of language is apparently a very recent phenomenon, apparently along with modern humans, Homo sapiens, 200,000 to 300,000 years, which is a flick of an eye in evolutionary time. So it's almost yesterday, before the emergence of Homo sapiens. There is no serious evidence in the archaeological record of any kind of symbolic communication or complex evidence of complex thought or anything that suggests that language in anything like our sense was actually present. And not long after the appearance of Homo sapiens, you get very rich, complex symbolic expression. Now, when I say very long, I'm speaking in evolutionary time, so tens or even hundreds of thousands of years, which is essentially nothing because we don't have details about the intermediate period. There is genomic evidence, which is pretty solid, that humans began to separate roughly 150,000 years ago. And they all share the language faculty. So as far as we know, this is universally shared. Any child in any culture can learn any language with equal facility, as far as we know. So it seems to be a shared capacity. We're all alike. In fact, altogether, there's very little genetic diversity among humans, which is understandable. We're a very recent species. Evolutionary biologists sometimes say that if you see a troop of monkeys, they probably have more genetic diversity than the entire human species. Maybe that's true, maybe not. But the point is, we're basically all the same organism from an outside point of view. And the language faculty seems to be shared. Well, if you think about it, if This means that the language faculty was present before the separation, and it doesn't seem to have been present before Homo sapiens appeared. So that's a very narrow window in evolutionary time. So yes, there's a long evolutionary history for everything, but it seems that what led to this unique capacity appeared very suddenly, pretty much along with the appearance of modern humans. And it is a unique capacity. Has no analog in the animal world, nothing remotely like it, and shared among humans. So it seems to be a species property, a true species property, essentially defining of humans. And in many respects, fundamental respects, our most essential property. It's basically the property of ability to construct thought, reflect, analyze, plan, all kinds of things that humans can do and other organisms can't. They have many abilities, many of their capacities go way beyond ours. It's not a matter of more or less. So I happen to live in the desert, and the desert ants in my backyard, who have minuscule brains, can barely see them with a microscope, but they have cognitive capacities that go far beyond humans. Humans can't begin to navigate the way the desert ants can. So it's not a more or less matter, just a different matter. But we have these unique special capacities, which are pretty much definitive of the human species. And they seem to have appeared very suddenly. Well, that's universal grammar. Universal grammar is just a theory of whatever this is.
So, do you still hold this view, Professor, up to this day, Father, Professor?
Hold this up to, well, that's an interesting question. I'm sure you're familiar with Fermis, what's called Fermis paradox. Fermi was a distinguished astrophysicist. He knew that there are endless numbers of planets in the part of the universe that we can access that have conditions that should lead to the emergence of life and even of higher intelligence. But the paradox is we can't find anything. With the most extensive efforts, there has been no trace of any sign of any kind of intelligent life anywhere. Well, there are various theories about this. One of them, which can't be discounted, is that higher intelligence is basically a lethal mutation, that higher intelligence develops the technical capacity to destroy, but not the moral capacity to control that impulse. Well, we're demonstrating that right now. We've shown for 75 years that we have the capacity to destroy everything ever since the first atomic bomb. But we have not yet developed the moral capacity to arrest the race to destruction in which we are now engaged. Maybe that's a property of higher intelligence. That's why we can't find any. That's a grim forecast. Maybe wrong, not necessarily wrong. But these are, when you ask about, I assume you were asking about extraterrestrial intelligence. That's about where we stand. We can't find any indication of it.
So, following your thought, Professor Chomsky, that we are pre-programmed by a long history of evolution. So therefore, somehow our capacity is limited. I mean, there are things that we can actually put in language, and there are things that cannot be put in language. Is that right?
Well, it's actually an open question. There are many who believe that human intelligence can deal with any problem, and that any problem that can exist can be formulated in human linguistic within linguistic capacities and answered. I don't see any particular reason to believe that. If we're like other organisms, not angels, then our capacities will have a certain scope and certain limits. And in fact, that's almost close to a point of logic. The fact that you have rich capacities is because of internal structure that permits them to develop. So humans are able to walk, run. That's because of internal capacities, that internal structure that allows the embryo to develop into a creature that can walk and run. But by the same token, we can't fly. The same principles that provide enormous scope for development also impose limits on it. Well, the question is whether that should also be true of cognitive capacities. We know that it's true of all other organisms. So, for example, rats can be taught to run mazes, pretty complicated mazes, but they can't be taught to run a maze, a prime number maze, a maze that says turn right at every prime number choice. Can't possibly train a rat to do that. They don't have the concept. Well, are we different from the rest of the world? Maybe, but you'd need an argument to show it.
So, do you think, Professor Chomsky, there are questions that human beings cannot answer?
Experience certainly suggests that. So there are questions that were answered, simple, straightforward questions that were posed millennia ago, 2,500, 3,000 years ago. We still have no way of answering them, no ideas, in fact, not even bad ideas. So just take what we're doing right now. As far as we know, you and I, each of us decides what to say next. In fact, I can decide whether to lift my finger or not. We all believe that. Some of us deny it, but we act as if we believe it all the time. We all act as if we believe, yes, I could lift my finger. Yes, I'm going to answer you with something that's relevant to our discussion. I'm not going to respond to you by talking about the latest baseball game, okay, or the history of medieval Europe or anything else. We're making a choice to do something appropriate to the situation. I'm raising my finger because I decided to illustrate my freedom of will. Nobody has any explanation for this. How can this possibly happen? I mean, there are claims, but basically they're based on nothing. All we know is science can't say anything about it. It may be because human science is just too limited. And I think there are historical examples of this. It's very interesting, something I've discussed at some length, but it's a very interesting moment in the history of science, crucial moment in the 17th century. 17th century was the birth of modern science. Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, that's modern science. Well, they had a conception of the world. Their conception of the world was it's a mechanical device. It's a much more complex example of the kind of artifacts that skilled artisans were then constructing all over Europe. And this was constructed by a super skilled architect, divine architect. That was the criterion for intelligibility. It was held that no theory is intelligible unless you can duplicate it with a mechanical device. That was the 17th century. We have something similar today with the thoughts about duplicating things with computable programs. They're also machines in an abstract sense. But that was the 17th century. Well, Newton came along and showed that there aren't any machines. Nothing works this way. The world works by what were called occult properties, like interaction without contact. That idea was considered totally absurd. And Newton himself regarded it as an absurdity that no person with any scientific understanding could ever tolerate. And that's why he called his own work mathematical principles, not physics. He said, I don't have a physical theory. I can't explain it. It's an absurdity. All I can do is say, this seem to be the properties of the way things work. Well, science actually made a major change at that point. It stopped trying to find intelligible theories, intelligible pictures of the world. It kept trying to find theories that were intelligible. So Newton's theory was intelligible. It was the world that he described that was absurd, made no sense, unintelligible. Well, that could be a case of the limits of human intelligence. We can't conceive of the kind of world that actually exists, that our theories tell us exists. And from that point on, science just goes on to postulating one absurdity after another, as long as they give you theories that explain things. We don't try to find intelligibility anymore. We've given up. Could be that that's an example of the limits of human cognitive capacity. We've just lowered the sights. We don't even try anymore. We just try to find explanatory theories that are the best account we can find. And if we don't understand what we're talking about, so much the worse. So you can pick up a journal of quantum physics, in which I just saw one recently, in which half a dozen quantum physicists are discussing the question, what is a particle? Can't be any question more fundamental than that. They have no idea. We have no idea what particles are. Richard Feynman, one of the great figures in quantum physics, once said, nobody understands quantum physics. We can use it. We know how to use it. We get good results, but nobody knows what it's about. In fact, that's been true since Newton. Nobody understands how you can have a world that's can't be duplicated by some kind of mechanical object.
So, Professor, in a sense, do you agree with Immanuel Kant that we can only know the phenomenon but not the nomenon?
Well, Kant, who was, of course, enormously influenced by Newton's discoveries, tried to put all of this in a more general framework, which was not, of course, original to Kant. Nothing ever is. There were considerations in the 17th century before Kant about how the phrase that was used is that experience conforms to our modes of cognition. We have certain ways of dealing with what we call experience, what's immediate to us. That's our modes of cognition. And experience has to be shaped by these modes of cognition. There may be things out there that are just we can't grasp. Kant put all of this in a broader framework of noumena and phenomena. Said, yes, we can deal with phenomena. We can't deal with whatever lies behind them. We just assume it.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. So let's move to artificial intelligence, the question about artificial intelligence. So do you think, Professor, that we can apply the word thinking to machines like computers?
Well, first of all, let's be clear. A machine like a computer, this thing that's on my desk, can't do anything. It's a paperweight, you know. It can execute a program. That's what it's designed for. It's the program that's the theory, not the machine. The machine is just like a kind of a printer or something. It's executing some program that's handed to it. So the real question is, can programs think? Not can machines think. Well, a program is a machine in an abstract sense. The term machine is used ambiguously. Sometimes it means the physical object. Sometimes it means the program that it's executing. So when Alan Turing was talking about machine intelligence, he meant the program. He didn't think the computer was thinking. That's just a turn of phrase. It's the program. So the question is, to rephrase your question, it's, can programs think? Well, what's a program? A program is just a theory written in a certain notation that that a computer can implement. But a program is a theory. It's a strange sort of theory. It's a theory that has to answer every question. If you have a program and you leave things unspecified, computer crashes. Okay? So and that's not like any theory that we know. The actual theories, even in physics, aren't, except for very narrow areas, are never complete. Like, what's a particle? So a program is a theory expressed in a notation that computers can implement and that answers every possible question. Then rephrasing your original question, can a theory like that deal with thinking? Is it a theory of thinking? Okay, now we have a real question. It's a question of cognitive science. Can there be theories of thought? Well, we have steps towards that, as in all the sciences. You don't have complete answers. You have steps towards things. So, for example, universal grammar is a step towards a theory of thought. It says, here are the possible ways of expressing thoughts. That's a step towards it. Now, if you go back to the long tradition, thousands of millennia, back to classical Greece, classical India, maybe classical China, we don't have documents, but at least classical Greece and classical India, 2,500 years ago, they took language and thought to be basically identical. Language is what generates thought. Thought is what's generated by language. And that tradition lasted for over 2,000 years. In fact, up until the 20th century, go through the late 19th century, the language was just described as audible thought that you externalize in some sensory motor medium. That changed in the 20th century with the behaviorist and structuralist movements, which took a different point of view for the first time. They regarded language as a form of behavior inculcated by training, matter of habit. Structural linguistics considered language to be some kind of social phenomenon, big change. I think it was a mistake. my own feeling is that we're now going back to the tradition. We're finding more and more evidence that the tradition was essentially correct, that language and thought can't be distinguished. They're fundamentally the same thing, at least thought in any sense in which we have any grasp of it. I mean, I have a couple of dogs. They do complicated things. If you want to call it thought, okay, but it's nothing like what we call thought in humans. Well, that's that going back to whether machines think. From this point of view, it's the question, can we construct a theory of thought? This has little to do with artificial intelligence, I should say. Artificial intelligence, back in the days of its sort of classic period, Alan Turing, Herb Simon, Marvin Minsky, they were all interested in artificial intelligence as a way to approach understanding of thinking. Artificial intelligence has taken a very different direction. Now it's an engineering profession. It's, can we construct things that are useful, like this live transcription option that I'm now using. The live transcription option is quite useful. It helps me hear what you're saying. I'm glad they have it, but it's pure engineering. It has nothing to do with science. It's the result of, it's a deep learning achievement, which uses astronomical amounts of data and supercomputers to find superficial regularities in the data that they're surveying, and it yields a useful result. But it tells you nothing about language, nothing about thinking, has no connection to science. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm glad it's there, but it's a sharp break from what the classical period, from what Turing and others intended by artificial intelligence. For them, it was basically a branch of cognitive science.
So how about consciousness, Professor Chomsky? Do you think that we can explain consciousness through a materialistic framework, purely materialistic framework?
Well, same kind of question. It's asking, first of all, what's a materialistic framework? We don't have any concept of that. Galileo had a concept. Isaac Newton had a concept, namely something that can be modeled by a mechanical object. It's what was called the mechanical philosophy. Philosophy meant science, so mechanical science. Well, that was shown not to work. The world can't be, is simply not captured by any mechanical object. That's what Newton regarded as a total absurdity, except that it's true. So we don't know what materialism means. We don't know what matter is. Actually, this was pointed out clearly by people like Bertrand Russell, Arthur Eddington, great scientist, over a century ago. As Russell put it, what we know most clearly is our own immediate consciousness. That's what we know and understand. I could describe for you in great detail what my immediate consciousness is, what I'm seeing, what colors there are, and so on and so forth. What we don't understand is matter. We don't understand how whatever matter is, we don't know what it is, but whatever the world's constituted of, call that matter, we don't know how that yields this phenomenon that we do understand, consciousness. So the problem's not consciousness, the problem's matter. Now, this problem in the philosophical literature, I think, is badly misstated, badly misformulated. If you look at modern philosophy, it's what it regards as its core issue is what's called, in fact, the hard problem. The hard problem is what it's like to see the sunset, what it's like to be a bat, that's the hard problem. It's not a problem at all. It's not a formidable problem. There is no answer to what it's like to see a sunset. There is an answer to a different question, what it's like to see this sunset. If I'm watching a particular sunset, I can tell you what it's like to see that sunset. In fact, I can describe it in great detail, but I can't describe what it's like to be a sunset. It's a meaningless formulation. There's no answer to that. It's not an intelligible question. So I think philosophers just barking up the wrong tree. There's no answer to the kinds of questions they're posing. There could be an answer to a different question. What's the nature of matter, whatever matter is, that enables me to have what I am most confident about, namely my immediate consciousness? That's a problem. But I think there's a lot of misleading discussion about this. So the real question is, can we have a theory of matter which will account for consciousness, conscious experience? So far, we don't have one.
So, if you will be asked for Professor the question, what is consciousness? What will be your answer, Professor?
Consciousness is, I can describe to you in close detail what my current consciousness is. I see a screen in front of what I take to be, notice, may not be there, but my modes of cognition yield the sense that I'm seeing a screen with a face on it, and it's the face of a human being, and it's in front of a background which has books. All of this is my mental constructions that constitute my current consciousness. I could go on in endless detail about it. That's consciousness. That's what we're most confident about. As Russell put it, the rest of our intellectual endeavors are to try to make some sense of it. What's going on in whatever the world is that yields these phenomena. But we don't know enough about the world to answer that question.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. So let's move to the question about democracy. So today, do you think, Professor, with all that's happening around us, do you think democracy is still the best form of government?
It would be, not is, because it doesn't exist. But there are various elements of democracy here and there, and they're good things. So it's a good thing that I can, right now, talk about this topic to you, and I don't have to be afraid that stormtroopers are going to come into the room and drag me away and send me off to a concentration camp. Okay, that's an element of American democracy. I'm glad it's there, but it's very far from anything we could call democracy. So let's just take what's happening right now. A day or two ago in the US Senate, most important body in the world, is the most powerful country in the world history. What happens here is going to determine the fate of the earth. Nothing small, serious. Well, 2 days ago, one senator, who happens to be a coal baron, who was elected with 300,000 votes, decided that the world should hurtle towards terminal catastrophe. That's not the way it's described, but that's what happened. I'm referring to Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, who said he will not accept any government program that deals with global warming, well, or that will tax rich people, which is one of the ways to deal with it. Won't accept anything. As I say, he was elected by 300,000 votes. He basically decided that the most powerful country in world history can't do anything to prevent us from hurtling to environmental catastrophe, which will end the possibility of organized human life. It's not a small thing. Is that democracy?
So, to push further the question, Professor Chomsky, with the rise of social media, all of us are susceptible to misinformation and deception. And this affects the way we participate in politics, in governing our community. Do you think that people are still capable to exercise genuine democracy today?
Didn't quite catch it. Let me wait till the live transcription comes. Are they capable of exercising it? Sure. That's why we have the freedoms that we have. They weren't a gift from God. They were fought for. Every bit of freedom that's been won was won by hard struggle against power and domination, which doesn't give up easily. Has to be won. And the whole of history is efforts to win some form of freedom and democracy from power systems. It's a simplification, but it's basically true. So can we use it? Sure we can. Question is how much? Take what I just mentioned. Doesn't have to be this way. There would be ways for the American system to function so that a coal mine owner who was voted with a handful of votes can decide to drive the world to destruction. Doesn't have to be that way. But you have to do it. In Singapore, you have to do it even more. But it can be done.
So, what is your assessment, Professor Chomsky, of what's happening today? I mean, the pandemic, the war between Russia and Ukraine. How do these events affect the economy and politics of the developing countries, like countries in Asia, for example?
Well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a major crime, rather like the US invasion of Iraq, and hundreds of other cases in history. Deplorable crime, no justification for it. As I'm sure you know very well, better than I do, most of the world, so-called global South, is saying it's basically not our business. Yes, it's a crime, but you, the West, have no right to be standing on any high horse about it. This is what you've been doing to us for centuries. Okay, now it's being done to you. Wrong, but we're not going to take part in it. If you look at the sanctions map, it's Europe, the English-speaking countries, and Japan, the country that white South Africa called honorary whites. That's basically it. The rest of the world is saying, your business, we're not taking part. So it's having a terrible effect on the world. Of course, it's terrible for Ukraine. Lots of ongoing destruction. It may destroy Ukraine. But meanwhile, it means that literally tens of millions of people are facing starvation because the Black Sea region, which is a major food and fertilizer exporter, is blocked. It means that the limited efforts to deal with the extraordinary crisis of global warming have been reversed. Instead of dealing with it, we're amplifying it. That's a hideous tragedy for the whole, not just for humans, but for all species on Earth. And we are moving towards destruction of the possibility of organized human life and millions of other species that we're destroying. There shouldn't be any question about that. Well, the Ukraine war has reversed the efforts to try to deal with it. And we don't have a lot of time. I mean, still possible. We have answers that would solve the problem, but it's a window that's narrow and it's closing. And the Ukraine invasion closes it further. It's also setting a stage which might lead to terminal nuclear war. That's not very far. You read, say, the British press a day or two ago. One of the leading, highly respected commentators, Simon Tisdale, had a column, interesting column, which he said the only answer to the Ukraine war is for NATO to enter directly and use its enormous power to drive Russia out of Ukraine. Now, what's Russia going to do if NATO intervenes? Say, thank you, that was fun. Or are they going to turn to their weapons, which of course they have, to respond to this? If they do, we're finished. Okay? A war between major nuclear powers is the end. Nobody escapes. So here you have a highly regarded, intelligent, liberal commentator in one of the centers of Western civilization, saying, "Let's go on and commit suicide." Nobody comments. I mean, some people say, "Well, shouldn't say that," but that just as nobody says what I just said about a senator deciding to terminate organized use and life on Earth. That's what's happening. We have to face that. The reality is not going to disappear if we decide not to look at it. So yes, this is all extremely serious. And is there a solution? Well, there's only one solution to wars. Either a war ends with diplomacy or it goes on to catastrophe. Maybe one side capitulating. Meanwhile, further tragedy. I mean, that much is just logic. Can't debate it. So the question we should be asking is, can there be a diplomatic settlement? Well, unfortunately, the United States, Europe going along with it, are saying very clearly, we're not going to tolerate a diplomatic settlement. That was the policy just announced at the NATO summit. They didn't put it in those words. But what they said was, in their words, the war must go on until Russia is weakened so severely that it can never carry out any such act again. What does that mean? It means basically turning Russia into an agricultural society. Are the Russians just going to sit there while this happens? That's the NATO position. In those words, I'm not making it up this time. That's how, that's NATO's official position, reinforced at the NATO summit, though the US had formulated it before. Well, that's the world we live in. Actually, the global South can make a major contribution here by saying, we're putting a brake on this. We're not going to allow this to happen. We're going to block it by whatever capacities we have. The West is caught up in kind of hysteria and is racing in this direction without limits. There has to be a break. Break has to come from within, but the global South can help it by taking a strong, firm position.
So, Professor Chomsky, for us in the developing countries, are we dependent on what's happening between America and Europe, Russia and Ukraine?
Very much so. I'm sure you're familiar with the famous comment that when elephants fight, it's the grass that's trampled. Well, that applies here. But the grass in this case is not without capacities and agency. It's the majority of the world has organizations like G77, former non-aligned countries, about 134 countries. They can take a strong stand. They can enter effectively into world affairs. They don't have to just say, we're going to be trampled. May not be enough, but it's what can be done.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Chomsky. So I would like to again move to another topic, Professor Chomsky, which is all about religion. So, what is your opinion about religion, and do you think we can rationally demonstrate the existence of God?
What's my opinion about religion and the existence of God? We can't rationally demonstrate the existence of God or the non-existence of God. In fact, we don't even know what it is that we're trying to demonstrate the existence of. What is it? So of course we can't. So, I mean, there are efforts to, there's huge intellectual efforts have gone into proofs of the existence of God back to the origins of the Abrahamic religions. Christian theology is full of efforts to prove it. There are modern efforts in terms of sophisticated efforts in terms of modal logic. I won't go through the arguments, but basically we're not going to do it. So question is, what about religion? Well, my own view is if people want to believe in some deity that is above everything, want to join communities where they pray to this deity, or want some other kind of religion like the Holy Spirit of the indigenous American communities. That's their business. I don't care, as long as they don't bother other people. You can have your own religious beliefs as long as you don't impose anything on others. Well, the United States, when it was founded, was based on that principle, but it's being torn to shreds. Right now, the Supreme Court, which is ultra-reactionary, one of its recent decisions in the last couple of weeks, which is a very dangerous one, sounds as though it's about a small issue, but it isn't a small issue. One of the cases they took up was a football coach in a high school who wants to pray on the middle of the field. And of course, he coerces the whole team into praying with him. A kid in a high school team is not going to refrain when the coach says, come join me to pray. Obviously, Supreme Court pretended otherwise, but they're just lying through their teeth. We have videos of what happened. Well, the court said he had a right to do that. So that's saying you have a right to, a coach in a high school has a right to coerce his players into joining him into religious expressions. Generalize that. Be Kantian now, again, let's generalize it. Says you can coerce people into being subordinated to your religious beliefs. The Supreme Court today is dominated by far-right Catholics who want to create a Catholic theocracy, and this is a step towards it. Notice we're not talking about Andorra, we're talking about the United States, the most powerful country in world history. What happens there has a big effect on the world. Well, it's a real issue, a live issue. They've done other things, like there was a barrier for a long time against tax funding of religious schools. Can't do that. They've taken that away. That means that I, a taxpayer, have to fund religious schools. That's a big break from the legal American tradition, at least. But it's a move towards a Christian theocracy, which is being pressed in many different ways. That's it's kind of like what India is doing, where Prime Minister Modi is trying to construct a Hindu theocracy, which will dismantle Indian secular democracy. And these are things which are happening in many parts of the world.
But do you think, Professor, are there good things that we can get from religion?
Are there good things? Plenty of them. There's plenty of opposition to what's going on. Plenty of popular opposition, organizing, education, activism makes a lot of difference. I mean, if you look at, I'm 94 years old. I have a lot of memories. You look back 50 or 60 years, unbelievable what people were doing then. You can't even imagine people saying it now. Take the United States, in many ways, the most free country in the world. Go back 60 years, the United States had laws against miscegenation, interracial marriage, laws so severe that the Nazis refused to accept them. The US had some public housing, federally government-supported housing. By law, it was segregated, whites only. Can't imagine that today. Women were not regarded as full persons. The United States still followed British common law, which the founders took over. According to that law, women were property. A woman's the property of her father, property is handed over to the husband. Well, of course, that didn't continue to exist exactly in that form, but it literally wasn't until 1975 that the Supreme Court struck it down. Goes on like this. There were things that were normal in the 1960s that are just unthinkable today. That's progress. Didn't come by magic. Wasn't a gift from above. Came from hard, dedicated struggle. That's the way things happen. So yes, there are lots of good things that can continue.
So lastly, Professor Chomsky, I would like to ask you to give a message to the Filipino people.
The only language is to think about the world the way it is, to ask how I can make it better. So take the Philippines. There are serious questions about the Philippines. There's been what's called an economic miracle in Asia. Very poor countries have become major industrial powers. Again, go back to the 1960s. Now, South Korea was at the level of a poor African country. It's now one of the world's leading industrial powers. Things like this have happened throughout Asia, throughout much of Asia. There are some exceptions. One exception is the Philippines. Why hasn't the Philippines taken part in this economic advance, miracle as it's sometimes called? Well, the Philippines is also the one country in the region which basically never escaped colonialism, still pretty much an American colony, not in force, not by institutions, but in practice. I think those two facts are correlated. Well, those are things the Philippines are also subjected to a highly authoritarian political system. In fact, have chosen it again in an election. Those are things that are very destructive to Philippine society. Philippines have to break out of this. Those are serious questions. What advice can anyone give from the outside? Overcome these problems. Help move the world in a more positive direction. Help create a world that decent people would want to live in. A world that satisfies human needs, not profit and power. Easy to say, hard to do, but it's because people have undertaken that task, that hard task, that we've gotten to a somewhat better world, and that's not ended.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Chomsky.
Thank you.